And here we are. Hello, everybody. Good evening. This is Still Moon Art Society's public talk series, and today we have the esteemed Deborah Harford with us to speak about climate change, equity, and nature-based solutions. My name is Adrian Evan Daniel. I'm currently the Stewardship Programs Manager for Still Moon, and alongside us we have Carmen Rosen, Artistic Director and founder of Still Moon Art Society. And just to give you all a quick download of what Still Moon is about, it's an organization facilitating community engaged art to facilitate ecological stewardship and ecological consciousness. And I'm very happy to be on board with Still Moon. I'm super grateful for being able to be with you all tonight. And I would also like to acknowledge that we are gathering in many spaces. And this includes the unceded and stolen territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Katsi, Semiahmoo, and Kwantlen First Nations, at least for me, and I'm currently in Surrey. And super indebted to all of the knowledge and the stewardship that the First Peoples have granted us to be able to be here. And I'm definitely very much looking forward to facilitating all the connections we need to make in order to make our world a more equitable place. And so thank you so much. And I'll hand it over to you, Deb, if you're ready to start.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much, Adrian. Hi, everybody. It's really great to be here. I'm a huge fan of Still Moon, as you will see. So I'm going to just, I've been working on climate change adaptation since 2006. I founded the Adaptation to Climate Change team, which is a think tank that studies adaptation at Simon Fraser University. So since 2006, a really large amount has changed in the adaptation world. When I started working on it, I principally started working on it because I could see that there was going to be some problems, which I'm going to talk about, and that we weren't really talking about adaptation at that time. We just had Al Gore had come out with An Inconvenient Truth, and the main discussion was around reducing our emissions, which is and remains the top priority. But what wasn't really being talked about was the fact that we've baked in some climate change and we're not stopping our emissions fast enough. And so we're going to have to deal with some changes. And responding to those changes is what we call adaptation. So in the past 14 years, I thought it was going to be a 5-year project. We've become an internationally recognized organization. We're still one of only 2 university-based adaptation think tanks in Canada. Actually in North America, I believe. It's strange, but it's true. And the discussion has evolved and spread enormously. And since COVID, I think the focus has really come onto equity and equitable solutions. So I'm going to be talking about that a little bit and giving some examples. And the other place that is really arising around the world is the interest in green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. And of course, Still Creek is a great example of a kind of a way that we can think about adaptation in the context of nature in the city. So I'll talk about a bit about that too. And I'm looking forward to discussing with you guys. Please, if you have thoughts, responses, questions, do put them in the chat. I hope that at the end, maybe we can turn microphones on and videos. People can, be present. But we'll just see how it goes. So I'm going to talk for probably about 30 minutes and then looking forward to a discussion. Or if everyone wants to go home early, then I totally understand. So thanks for the land acknowledgement, Adrian. I'm also going to begin with a land acknowledgement. I really like this map here that shows the interlocking lands of our some of the local Coast Salish peoples. Where I am, I'm on the shared territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh and Musqueam Nation. This land was never surrendered, relinquished, or handed over in any way. So in the new Zoom environment, I just always ask people to take a moment to acknowledge whose lands they're on. And to just state that we know that Indigenous nations are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, and Indigenous leadership is integral for climate justice. And it's crucial that we acknowledge the historical and ongoing racism and injustice towards racialized communities and Indigenous peoples. It's clear that we can no longer ignore the intersections of climate change and social justice, or historic patterns of environmental racism as we move forward. And as I say, my talk will come back to a little bit around that topic. So just to talk for a minute about why we're here, why I'm doing what I'm doing. We have seen a measurable temperature rise of around 1 degree centigrade since the mid-1800s. If you look at a concept called the Great Acceleration, it maps directly onto that, and it's basically the mass explosion of human population and activity that's directly correlated with the release of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, such as nitrogen oxide and methane. So, you know, there's a clear and measurable increase in temperatures. And with scientific projections, this is from Environment Canada a few years ago, these are the projections for what the temperature increases are going to be out to the end of the century. And the top line is the best case scenario. The middle line is the middle case, and the bottom line is the worst case. We're very lucky if we hit the best case. Most people think will probably be something around the middle case, but let's just think positively and look at the best case on the top. Even in the best case scenario, we see quite a bit of warming. And if you look at the middle column, 2046 to 2065, it's about the same. It doesn't really matter what we do with our emissions, we're going to see climate change. So this is why we need to study adaptation, which basically says there's going to be some changes caused by this warming. How do we respond? And that intentional response is what we call adaptation. And this is becoming even more important now because COVID-19 has damaged our economy to the point where we will definitely see a struggle economically for the next decade or more. And so we've also got climate change coming along on top of that. And so we have to think now about the money that we spend now, because whatever we spend now has to serve us well for the coming decades. And if we don't think about the climate changes that we are quite able to predict under each of those different scenarios I showed you, so we know what the downscaled impacts will be in Metro Vancouver, for instance. We've got to think about how we plan our cities, how we plan our ecosystem management, because what we do now will lock in either vulnerability or what we've started to call low carbon resilience. And I'll explain that low carbon resilience is adaptation, but a systemic and more effective approach to adaptation than just focusing on the climate change impacts. So I'm sure you're all aware that we've been given a deadline. Last year it was 11 years, now it's 10 years to reduce our emissions to a point that really means that we will have a livable future. And so if you're a local government, or even more and more now private sector corporation, they're starting to, constantly think about, well, how are we going to reduce our emissions? So we call that mitigation in climate action speak. And at the same time, think about, well, how are we going to reduce our vulnerability to climate change impacts? And they're doing both of these things at the same time. But almost no one in the adaptation world is thinking about emissions. And almost no one that I know in the emissions world is thinking about adaptation, which is particularly unfortunate because if you look at this graph, let's just say it represents adaptation on the up and down axis. And as you go up, your vulnerability goes down. So at the top, you've got the lowest vulnerability. And on the crossbar, you've got your emissions. And as you go to the right, your emissions go down. So we're starting out really in the lower left quadrant. We've got high emissions and high vulnerability because we just haven't really sorted ourselves out yet. So if you just focus on reducing your vulnerability and you go up to the top left quadrant, you've reduced your vulnerability, but you haven't thought about your emissions, because some adaptation actions actually increase emissions. So if you think about something like air conditioning, if you're in an area that has high emissions sources of electricity, things like seawalls and bigger drainage infrastructure is very emissions intensive because it has very high embodied emissions in concrete. So you'd actually be increasing your emissions if you weren't thinking about it. Alternatively, you can go along to the bottom right, reduce your emissions and not think about your vulnerability. So you can put a beautiful energy efficient installation, a district energy system, just let's say, in what will actually be a floodplain because your flood extent is going to increase because your sea level is going to go up, or your precipitation is going to get heavier, and so your river's going to flood more there. And your lovely district energy system isn't going to work because it's going to be flooded. So what we're trying to do now is talk about how you integrate these two imperatives. So we go up to the top right quadrant, lower vulnerability, lower emissions. And what happens when you start thinking about those two things in tandem and you start trying to really think about how do we do both at once? What you start to see is that certain solutions, like nature-based solutions, begin to emerge in that space as really attractive priority actions. But you can think about lots of other co-benefits too. So these examples here are all things, for instance, that are high priorities for local governments. They want to reduce congestion from traffic. They want to capture pollutants. They want improved access to green space and recreation. They want to improve water retention and absorption. They want to reduce waste. All of these are entry points into thinking about how you reduce vulnerability and emissions. And they're also all co-benefits of doing this thinking, and nature-based solutions have specific examples in these co-benefits. So really we're trying to advance a kind of systemic way of thinking about a sustainable development pathway that reduces emissions, reduces our vulnerability, and benefits all these things that are high community priorities, including health, welfare for vulnerable people, saving biodiversity from extinction, etc. And so we're trying to develop tools that help people think through how to go forward in that way. So just to reiterate a little bit there, just to go back over the importance of healthy ecosystems, which I'm sure, knowing the kind of people that hang out with Carmen, I don't have to reiterate this, but this is the narrative. And it's important that people think about healthy ecosystems as critical infrastructure, because we've always thought about them to date as kind of nice green things that are kind of worth zero. Oh, you got to put a house there. Oh, never mind. And as we start to understand the number of different things that healthy ecosystems are doing for us, we're starting to actually change that view and value what they do, but not just put a monetary value on them, which is something that has to be very carefully done and should only be done really when it's actually valuing the services they provide. Like, let's say it's an ecosystem area is absorbing stormwater. Well, the way you value that is what infrastructure would we have to build to absorb that stormwater if the ecosystem wasn't there? So you're not actually saying this ecosystem is worth X, because that would be, you really can't do that. They have intrinsic value, of course. But some of the values that you can calculate are that ecosystems absorb and store and release carbon if they're not taken care of. And you can put a price on carbon. We're already doing that. They clean the air. They absorb and recycle fresh water. They create shade for cooling. They provide home for species as their ranges shift. They underpin food security. They're cheaper to install, operate, maintain, and replace than what we call gray infrastructure, which is, say, things like pipes and seawalls. And although we don't want to talk about this in Vancouver much, they tend to increase property values, and they benefit quality of life, and they benefit human health. And I think that's become even more obvious during COVID. So you can actually put values on all of those things. And if you don't want to put a value on them, you can talk about their value in terms of, we need these things. And if you have one ecosystem doing all of those things, it's way better than having a bunch of different man-made infrastructures trying to do it. And all of those things are aspects of adaptation because they all respond to the impacts of climate change. So we're starting to talk about putting ecosystem components into cities intentionally. So while it's wonderful to rehabilitate the ecosystems that are there, people are starting to think about adding what we call green infrastructure, which might be things like green roofs, bioswales, rain gardens. And so but it also should be used to link up the existing pieces of ecosystem that are getting fragmented by urban space. And this is, again, has a value we can easily talk about, because the bigger the network, the bigger the value it provides. But of course, the bigger value it provides for biodiversity. So on the left, you've got a little schematic there of what it looks like when an ecosystem is connected up so species can move, and how they can't when it's fragmented. And this is so important because the middle graphic is the heartbreaking one, and it's the just to 2018, and we know it's even worse since then. The extinction of species is happening at just a horrifying rate. And of course, the corollary graph to this is the increase in human population, and that goes back. It's the same curve as the increase in climate and that great acceleration curve I was talking about. So, you know, it's really important that we help species survive, and they're being pushed as climate warms the country and warms everywhere on Earth. The same patterns happening. It's pushing species northwards and upwards. So they're trying to stay in the same band of temperature that they're used to. And so as the warming increases, it moves northwards. So, you know, everything's getting warmer and warmer, and the cold areas are getting pushed further and further to the north. And this results in things like, you know, in Peru, in the mountain forest ecosystems, they have what they call the escalator to extinction, because, you know, species move up and then they can't move up anymore, and they just wink out because there's nowhere for them to go, and other species are coming up behind. So we can help them survive by intentionally making strategically planned networks of natural and semi-natural areas. But this also provides local governments with bigger benefits in terms of larger scale storm water absorption, that kind of thing. And on the right, that's a schematic from the front page of the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects magazine from last year, where we had if you can see, it was called Low Carbon, and we were the feature article on low carbon resilience. And that on the front there is a schematic of the Ravine system in Toronto that somehow has survived the urbanization in that city, which is another nice example of a green infrastructure network. So just to kind of sum up the benefits of green infrastructure for low carbon resilience, as I've said, biodiversity and improved habitat, reduced emissions, and it reduces emissions because not only do green areas actually store carbon in soil and in trees and plant life, but they reduce the need for emissions intensive processes, as I've said, like air conditioning, but also things like stormwater pumping and filtering. So they also reduce the burden on grey infrastructure, and that's really important for our local governments, because local governments are facing a huge amount of infrastructure replacement. We've got, I think, $173 billion infrastructure deficit in Canada, which means that all of that infrastructure is aging and needs to be replaced. Well, if you can strategically plan rain gardens and other absorbent features like parks, or even Still Creek, you're taking water out of the aging drainage system. So it reduces the pressure on it. And, you know, engineers are a bit hesitant about this. Well, it doesn't have to replace it necessarily. It can be a complement to it. And so people are starting to try and think that through. How do you do that? As I've said, ecosystem presence improves water quality, reduces the impacts of flooding and extreme heat, etc. So as I've said, they work best when connected overall, but this is a map of ecosystem connectivity for North America. And you'll see that here in our area, it's actually represented as there not even being any ecosystems, because this area is so developed. This is what one of our funders, the Bullet Foundation, calls the Emerald Corridor, ironically, because it's Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver. And looking at this, you'd think there weren't any ecosystems there at all, but of course there are. And we need to think about how to really actively include that vision in our urban planning. And as I say, the more that people start thinking about low carbon resilience, the more they're starting to think about how to enact these nature-based solutions, which is good news. So Still Creek is one of those good news stories. And so we've been looking at these ideas since 2017 with funding from the Bullet Foundation. We started out looking at how two municipalities neighboring one another could collaborate to ensure the health of an ecosystem that crosses their border. And it's really hard for local governments to collaborate. You'd be absolutely amazed at how little forum they have to do that. And so Still Creek was a really beautiful example. Admittedly, it was really more Vancouver doing something because Burnaby was already quite intact. But nevertheless, they did collaborate. And if Burnaby wasn't as intact, then the benefits that showed up in Still Creek on the Vancouver side wouldn't have been as tangible. For instance, the salmon coming back up. But we did a bit of a systems map on the right here. And this is where it gets hard to convey systems thinking to people because it is such a complex proposition. But what we tried to express in this was just that all the different benefits of Still Creek being rehabilitated and how they all relate to one another. So, pollination and corridor connectivity, benefits to water quality, human health and well-being, soil and slope stability, mental health, physical health, carbon and air pollution absorption, etc. And so, just looking at how all of those things actually help and support one another. And I mean, just the school kids being able to go down and look at the salmon, I think is a really powerful one. Well, after that, we took that idea of the two municipalities collaborating across boundaries, and we went to Metro Vancouver to talk about how they could support the things that we'd discovered about what worked at Still Creek on a larger scale. Because Metro Vancouver has the capacity to sort of pollinate this thinking out across all 23 municipalities and First Nations that are adjacent and within Metro Vancouver's boundaries. And so the recommendations that we received when we sort of consulted about 50 people from across all the different professional associations, professional practitioners, all the local governments, the First Nations, community groups like Streamkeepers, and Metro Vancouver itself, to talk to them about, well, how do we, really help to advance the uptake of this kind of like large scale thinking about green infrastructure in Metro Vancouver? How do we make Metro Vancouver a mecca by 2050 of biodiversity-led green infrastructure? So green infrastructure that doesn't just benefit our stormwater absorption, et cetera, it actually really intentionally benefits biodiversity. And the recommendations that came back were that we needed to support a regional planning process with municipalities, community groups, and First Nations. We needed to look at incorporating green infrastructure in the regional growth strategy update that Metro Vancouver is currently undergoing, as well as municipal official community plans and regulations. There need to be policies, standards, targets, and reporting strategies co-developed with partner municipalities for stormwater and water quality, land use and development. And there needed to be an intentional effort to coordinate existing green infrastructure that considers climate migration of species that as I just mentioned, they're being pushed, and how we can connect up their habitat to capture macro benefits as well as low carbon resilience. So, we're just a small think tank. We definitely couldn't do all of that. But we did work with Metro Vancouver and succeeded in getting the regional approach to green infrastructure into the regional growth strategy update. So that guidance is there. Metro Vancouver is really keen on this. They've been doing quite a bit on it in terms of connecting, doing sensitive ecosystems inventory and looking how they can connect them up. And the other thing that we did was we connected with a group of non-governmental organizations, NGOs like Raincoast, Rivershed, the Georgia Strait Alliance, David Suzuki Foundation, Watershed Watch, Birds Canada, there's about 15 of them, and help them to come together in a network that we're calling AFER, which is the acronym at the bottom there, which is Adapting for Ecological Resilience. And they're focused on the Lower Fraser and looking at how they can help to reinforce and support one another and avoid duplicating efforts. And so this was our way of trying to respond to these other recommendations, to think about what do we actually need rather than having theoretical objectives, integrating across disciplines and jurisdictions, and encouraging collaborative professional development. And so lots of others are engaged in these kinds of initiatives as well. And so it's really encouraging to see that there's actually quite a bit going on here. And I think the most powerful statement to me came from the funder at the Bullitt Foundation, who the Bullitt Foundation is sunsetting and they're going to close down in 2024. And so they're really thinking about their legacy. And Bullitt have funded numerous initiatives throughout the Pacific Northwest, from down to Portland way up into BC. And the funder said, you know, in all his 30 years, the Lower Fraser looks to him like the place that could emerge as one of the most amazing good news stories about resilience and ecosystem conservation, and that to try and really support the Lower Fraser becoming a world-class example of a resilient watershed, which of course would include the Still Creek piece of it and many other pieces that could be connected up, would be a potential achievement that we could actually reach. And he said that out of all the things that he's funded. So I thought that was really encouraging. And that's kind of underscoring this AFER network. So I just want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the COVID-19 pandemic in the context of all of the things I've just brought to the table. And then just finish up with a little bit of how these initiatives can intentionally benefit equitable development for marginalized, racialized, and other vulnerable populations. So obviously during the COVID-19 pandemic, the value of nature has become even more obvious. I mean, you know, we knew that it was important for mental health. There's been lots of really good studies on that. But, you know, in times during lockdown where, you know, people living in apartment buildings didn't have access to gardens, or you know, going to the park, being able to walk amongst the trees was so important for people this spring. And so accessibility, who's got access to green space, has started to become a really big question, given the central importance of this to human health and well-being. People can be together outside at a distance as well. Not so much right now, but it's grey and rainy and it's harder to be together right now, but it has helped with community building. And I think it also reassured people a little bit around the concepts of local food security over the summer months where, you know, we were a bit worried about supply chains going down. I'm not saying that we could all start growing all our own food, but it's still encouraging to be able to go out and pick your own tomato or something if you've got a community garden. So all of these things help to build community as well. So not just in the green infrastructure and nature, access to nature-based areas, but equity has come up very strongly during COVID, obviously, because it's become very obvious that BIPOC and other marginalized and racialized and vulnerable populations, low income, for instance, are disproportionately being hit by the pandemic. And by, you know, everything from the loss of income, the exposure for people who are frontline workers, people whose health is not as good because they don't have as good access to amenities, etc., has started to really become very important. It was important before, but I'm sorry to say that even in the adaptation world, where it was quite obvious that climate change would disproportionately affect some people, equitable action has taken till now to really become a top priority. Same with health, and I'll put that down to the fact that when it's been a long struggle to get people to even accept that climate change is an issue, And then when they finally did, it was like, well, we're okay. Well, we're really worried about what the costs of flood are going to be. And so they thought about it as an engineering problem. Now, finally, we're getting to the point where it's a whole of society response. So just to ensure that we're on the same page, when I say equity, I'm talking about the fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all people, while striving to identify and eliminate barriers that have prevented the full participation of some groups. And the action to do this requires an understanding of the root causes of social outcome disparities. And we need improvements to increase justice within the procedures and processes of institutions or systems, as well as their distribution of resources. And this is another reason I think that equity or equitable development wasn't addressed soon enough in the adaptation world. You could also say this about the emissions reduction world, because energy poverty is a big issue as well. But I think it's because of the processes piece. People who are marginalized can't get to the table. They don't have the money to get there. They don't have the resources to get there. They don't have the capacity to get there. They're working 3 jobs. They don't have money for childcare. So, it seems so obvious now, but, people were missing this. And so these are some of the improvements that we need to think about. And so some of the emerging equity issues that, we've been seeing emerging both in the climate and the COVID space is a lack of affordable climate resilient housing, especially in Vancouver, uneven climate and health impacts, as I've mentioned. We're going to see more epidemics and pandemics, unfortunately, likely in a changing climate. And so, those people will continue to be more vulnerable than others. There's unequal access to green space, as I've said. I mentioned energy poverty. And redlining is where an area is delineated for development and suddenly becomes, and may have been an area where people could afford to live, and then suddenly they can't because it's marked for development and becomes gentrified. So some of the conclusions that we've drawn from that, and not just us, but others too, but we're certainly being quite vocal about these conclusions, is that there can be no climate action without climate justice. We must consider not just equity, but an equitable distribution of benefits for whatever it is that we're trying to, whatever benefits we're trying to achieve. We have to embed that thinking in proactive policy for healthier and more resilient communities, because the more resilient individuals are, the more resilient the community is, less pressure on health systems, that kind of thing. And so it's actually, again, late to the table, the adaptation world, to realize that if you actually reduce poverty and increase people's access to basic amenities, and not just basic amenities, but economic opportunities and all of the other things that help us thrive, your community will be more resilient from a people perspective, and that will reduce the pressure on your systems, et cetera, as well as being benefit for those people. And so, especially the increase in green infrastructure that I was talking about, where we have this fantastic, it's very exciting to see people really uptaking nature-based solutions. It gives me hope for, us helping biodiversity, pollinators, all of that. But if we don't think about how we put that in, we risk things like gentrification. We risk putting it in places where people who need it the most won't access it, etc. So we need to have some really thoughtful planning. So I'm just going to give you 3 examples of actually some really great examples of this happening. This one in the city of Edmonton happened during the pandemic and was designed to increase local food security. And it was a sort of pop-up community garden pilot where they installed 350 garden plots across 30 locations throughout the city. But where they were put was based on people's proximity, the need, where people didn't have very good proximity to grocery stores and numbers of multifamily dwellings. So in other words, where people, if you're living in a multifamily dwelling, you have less access to green space because there's lots of you in a apartment building, and also the benefit for children in terms of this kind of thing, as well as parents, was quite obvious. And so this was actually quite a success, and the community was very pleased with it. The 11th Street Bridge project is a really interesting project in, oh God, I forgot where it is. I think it's in Washington, DC. And but I'll correct myself later if I've got that wrong. But basically, the 11th Street Bridge spans two areas. On one end of the bridge, there's quite an affluent area, and on the other end of the bridge, there's a very low-income area. And I don't know if you guys know the High Line in New York, but it's a project where they basically greened and made a community amenity out of what used to be a railway bridge in New York. And this was a similar project. So they made this bridge into a mix of green space and recreational space. And they specifically did it to benefit the low-income neighborhood on the other end of the bridge, or that end of the bridge. And so some of the key actions that they took to ensure that it really did benefit the lesser advantaged area were to act very early. In other words, long before they designed the project, they started talking to the community. They looked at regional and national champions doing similar work to gain, leapfrog ahead and gain insights. They centered equity as a core priority in all levels of decision-making, including their staff and hiring practices, their volunteer engagement, and their board of directors. They ensured that there was money to support people's engagement. So they provided childcare. They paid people to come. They paid for their transportation, that kind of thing. So they ensured that the community really was able to be at the table rather than sort of, oh, well, we think this would be nice for the community and designing it for them. They acknowledged intersectional needs such as housing and employment that would be affected by the bridge project and tried to build in ways to benefit them as well. They created measurable goals so the community could see and they could be accountable for how the project was working. And they accepted that the project would need to develop on an ongoing basis rather than being a solution that was kind of like monolithic and put in place. And I think that last point, all of these points are important, but the last point is crucial for adaptation to climate change because we continually learn more. We will continue to learn more and more. So you have to constantly think about how we're going to keep adapting this. There's another reason to do that, which is that if you try, let's say we're looking at sea level rise, and the projection of sea level rise, say on our coast here, is 1 meter by 2100. That's the sort of average projection. When you build to sea level rise, you don't just build to the amount of sea level rise, you have to take into account king tides, what they call freeboard, which means you've got X amount of space between the top of the water and where the walkway begins. You have to consider coastal storms. You have to consider the foreshore and the aquatic environment. And so if you actually build to the full height that 1 meter means, it's actually 3 meters. So nobody's going to put up add 3 meters of dike. Like that would be, staggering undertaking. It'd be far too expensive. No one could do it. So you have to think about, well, how can we do a bit? And then what do we need to phase this project so that we don't waste money? We don't try and build it all at once. So that's just another example of how adaptation requires kind of iterative thinking, so bit by bit. And the last example I'm going to give you is a sea level rise example. So obviously one of the impacts of the warming I was talking about is sea level rise all around the world, but it's not predictable, and it's predictable, but it's not even. So it's not like you can't just say, oh yeah, everywhere's going to get 1 meter, because believe it or not, some of our landscape is still rising from the glacier melt after the last ice age. This is a very slow process, but it's called what they call isostatic rebound. And so some areas are actually rising, which will offset the sea level rise, which will be gradual, and it'll be millimeters per year, unless we get a big step change, in which case it might go up more suddenly. But so you can map these things, and we know that in the area of the Musqueam Nation, they will be similar to the other areas of BC that are projected to have 1 meter of sea level rise by 2100. So we recently did a national webinar with Grant Falgren, and Grant is an Ojibwe landscape architect who he did his degree at UBC, and he worked on traditional knowledge and sea level rise planning with the Musqueam Nation, and he won a really major prize for this work, and he's now the chair of the Reconciliation Advisory Committee for the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects. So it was a huge honor to have Grant with us for this webinar, which was about this topic that I'm talking to you about now, about equity and how to build equity using nature-based solutions and green infrastructure. And so Grant's project was looking at how the Musqueam Nation had traditionally used the foreshore. And he worked with the nation to help them understand more about what the sea level rise projections were, and then to apply traditional knowledge. And as he emphasizes, traditional knowledge is not just knowledge that has been accumulated by Indigenous peoples over the past millennia, but it's living knowledge that goes into the future. And so it's the application of their understanding of the land and how it works. And then you apply it to this new problem of sea level rise. And they developed an entire solution about how this could be done in a way that would support their traditional practices, their use of plants and their food fishery, and in ways that would really support and nurture the nation in creative ways that respect their traditions and their cultural interests and values. So this was really an inspiring and unique project that I hope we'll see lots more of, but it's another beautiful example of, because this of course is sequestering carbon as well. It's a low carbon resilience approach. So just wrapping up here, I think I've got, no, this is my last slide. Wow. All right. So I like this quote, that our post-pandemic challenge will not only be to preserve the last remaining natural places, but to create more of them, especially in cities, and to make sure all children and adults, not just a few, receive the gifts of nature. And as I've discussed, the gifts of nature are many and varied and valuable, and they do include low carbon resilience, which will be essential for us going forward. So I'm going to close and see if anyone has questions, wants to discuss any of this. If you're interested in knowing more about our low carbon resilience work, just ping me an email at actinfo@sfu.ca. We send out newsletters that show everything from like briefings for mayor and councillors to how local governments are thinking about this, case studies on how people are already doing this work. So lots of inspiring stuff. And I didn't put this in the presentation, but I did tell Carmen this, that I've just had a chapter published in a new book on ethical water stewardship, which looks at how we really need to look at how we work with water as we go forward into our changing world. And my chapter is called Streams of Consciousness, and it talks all about really the global picture, but it anchors it all in the story of Still Creek and the way that Still Moon helped to do a community approach to rehabilitating the creek. So I'm going to get a copy of that and send it to Carmen so she can see it. Yeah, okay, and I'll stop there and happy to take any questions or discuss anything with you guys.
Wow, thank you so much, Deborah. That was incredible. I have some questions, but I'll leave it to folks who are here. So please, maybe this is a time we can unmute ourselves potentially. So if anyone has a question, please don't hesitate and do so. And if that's not your vibe, you can write something in the chat.
Totally, yeah. If you want to put your video on or unmute or anything.
You want to share your screen, Deb?
Yeah, sure. I'll stop
sharing. We can see more of a
yeah
gallery view of everybody. If
yeah.
Questions. I'll start with a question about what do you think about the city's Rain City strategy and some of the things that Vancouver is doing, like from a adaptation to climate change perspective lens?
Well, Vancouver was the first city in Canada to have an adaptation plan. That was in 2012, and they refreshed it in 2018. And both times I was asked to go and speak to Mayor and Council and support both times. And to my great surprise and delight, Mayor and Council ratified it unanimously both times. And so, yeah, Vancouver's been very progressive on adaptation. And then the Rain City strategy is a great example of a municipality trying to think through how to do this green infrastructure approach that I've been talking about, although their main approach to it is not biodiversity focused. So I've been trying to encourage them to increase their use of a biodiversity lens. I think they're working with Van Play, which is the Parks and Recreation Plan, which is based on equity. But the challenge that Rain City Strategy is having is to actually land it, because as is very often the case right now, and I kind of obliquely referred to this, engineers are very nervous about using nature-based solutions because, and for very good reason, I won't knock engineers for this. Engineers of all the professional practice sectors are legally liable for the performance of their projects. They actually have to stamp the project and say this is going to work. And if it fails, they're legally liable. Well, we don't yet have really good technical specifications for how green infrastructure works in terms of absorbing flood water, which is mostly what engineers are concerned about. So we used some of our funding for the projects I was just talking about from the Bullet Foundation to invest in the, and there's an organization called the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, which is working on this approach I was talking about to value the services that ecosystems provide. And they did what I thought was a really good idea, which was they worked with the Professional Association for Engineers and Geoscientists BC. They've been working with them to develop practice guidelines for engineers on green infrastructure projects. And that's literally in review right now. So that will be hugely helpful. And I hope that it will help initiatives like the Rain City strategy get actually implemented, because it will help engineers get their heads around it. Because I think that what they're having a bit of trouble with is getting engineers to agree to really kind of make the project happen. But it's a very good project, and it's got a lot of appreciation. And Melina Schofield, who's leading it, she's a really visionary person. So I think it's got a really good chance of becoming a great example.
Yeah, that was my experience too. Melina is amazing, yeah, and getting the engineers to is the sticky point.
Yeah, and as I say, I have a lot of sympathy for them, because landscape architects, planners, they don't have to put that legal stamp on it, and so it's a question of, well, how do we help them? How do we help this happen? So yeah. I hope those practice guidelines from Municipal Natural Assets Initiative will help. But I think, so many different countries are working on this kind of approach, that if we don't get it here soon enough, it's going to appear in other countries too. And it's going to become business as usual. But hopefully it'll happen in time before we put in a whole bunch of new grey infrastructure, right? Like, as I was saying, like, that's not going to be ideal. We don't really know how big the pipes need to be anymore, that kind of thing. So, hopefully we'll see more green infrastructure investment sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
Deb, I'm really curious to hear what you have to say about, as we know, like this is kind of like a multi-pronged thing that we have to strive for, with local governments, national governments, individuals, all this. How do we keep in mind the fact that the majority of the, for example, greenhouse emissions and just overall usage of our planet's resources are being used by 10% of the population, right? In terms of like people with immense amounts of wealth, and that may actually include some of us in, like, first world countries and all of this. So how and also the fact that industry is a huge influencer in this regard too. And so how do us as local communities and neighborhoods be able to keep up with the inaction of other very important stakeholders like this?
Yeah, well, I think making it a good news story. I always try and we talk about no doom and gloom. Let's cheer and steer. Because nobody wants to be told you've got to give everything up and you're going to have to suffer and make sacrifices. It's just not a popular message. We've tried it; it doesn't work. And so, making it into a good news story, opportunities. Corporations love to look good in communities. So, I thought the 11th Street Bridge project was a good example. But I will say this too, that actually there are really major movements happening now that are going to start influencing those wealthy sectors. So we have the task force on climate disclosure, which it really says, you're at risk if you're heavily invested in high emissions or fossil fuels processes and products, because the consumer is moving away from those. People are really turning to eco-friendly products. They're asking those questions, but also it's starting to be seen by shareholders as a risk if you're not thinking about that. And the other aspect of climate risk, of course, is thinking about how climate change impacts are going to actually affect your business. So leading bankers like Canadian Mark Carney, who went to the Bank of England, have been ringing that bell really loudly. So is Bloomberg, former mayor of New York, who's massively wealthy investor type. These guys, Tom Steyer, who's a billionaire investor, some of the very wealthy are really pushing for that, and it's starting to show up now in the private sector in terms of corporate risk disclosure. Once you put it in those terms, it starts to take on a different color for them. It starts to be more about due diligence and success, and so that's a language they speak. So it's also like, how do you translate this stuff into the language that actually matters to those people? Because we can want it to matter to them because it should, but it doesn't. And again, that doesn't seem to work very well. So making it into either reporting requirements and risk assessment, which it now is, it's going in there in the mainstream, and also make it into a good news story, an opportunity story. The consumer wants this now. So those are a couple of responses. I mean, it's a big question, Adrian.
Yeah.
As for how communities do it, I say keep doing what you're doing, because I think the biggest challenge, perhaps one of the most important pieces of work we can do, is improve our community fabrics. Like just what you guys do with Still Moon is a beautiful example of we need many more Still Moons. So I think more of a question is, how do we fund that, right? Because we all know that it's hard to be a small nonprofit. And so we have to put more pressure on our provincial and federal governments to increase support for nonprofits and for community organizations, to think about how do we get people to volunteer? How do we get people to really work on things that we can tangibly all benefit from?
Absolutely. Does anyone else have some questions? Either please feel free to unmute yourself or put your video on right in the chat. We'd love to hear from you all.
Well, a joke.
Deb, do you know if they're still planning to move the hospital to the floodplain on False Creek Flats?
Yeah, they are. And so
resilience and politics not always talking to each other.
Well, it's a really interesting case, that, because Providence Healthcare is private sector. The city is not in charge of Providence Healthcare. The province is, because the health authority is a public sector organization. So it's a really great example of a kind of like collision of different levels of jurisdiction, making decisions that are kind of, people are kind of going, okay, but they're not actually in charge of it. but I don't think that that Providence Healthcare would have made that decision if they hadn't been quite confident that the city of Vancouver is going to mitigate sea level rise, because the city of Vancouver is not going to let that area flood. They've got all kinds of things. They've got ideas about putting, gates across the underneath the I guess it's the Renfrew Bridge or the Broad Bridge, but anyway, the one that comes up to the Falls Creek, things like that. So they're really thinking very carefully about how are they going to keep the city intact. And so, that area will probably be okay because the city's going to take that responsibility. But it wasn't the city that made the decision to put the hospital there, and I'm pretty sure they wouldn't have chosen to do so.
Wow, that's so interesting. So that's like in Venice where they have those storm surge floodgates and things?
Yeah, and actually the Thames Barrier in London, which they put in, I don't know if you've seen pictures of the Thames Barrier, but it's this extraordinary installation of massive like metal things that I don't even understand how they work. But they thought basically that they might use that flood barrier like maybe once every 5 years. They've already used it like 10 times in the first 2 years. So it's quite amazing how much storm surge is happening, which is partly because the atmosphere gets more charged with energy because it's warmer, but also because of the rising sea. But yeah, so the city's thinking a lot about it. We're actually quite lucky in Vancouver because we're on, it sort of does this, Vancouver. We're actually on quite a high ridge, especially where you and I are right now, Carmen. Yeah. And so the inundation that's projected with sea level rise, and those maps are public. You can go on the Fraser Basin Council's website. Just Google sea level rise maps for, I think it's the Lower Fraser or Metro Vancouver, but City of Vancouver only really floods a little bit around the edges. If you're Surrey now, you've got a slightly different problem because you've got the Fraser flooding and they're much lower and they have a lot more. They have Boundary Bay, for instance, Delta, Richmond, Surrey. The flooding looks a little more scary there.
With the current flooding,
looking forward to it.
Yeah. With the flooding looks something like the 1948 flood that we had here. Where like Chilliwack completely flooded and
it was terrible. And so there's the two floods of record, 1849 and 1948 or something. They're actually the same numbers, just rearranged, which is kind of weird. But like right now, it would be worse than the flood of record. But what's quite shocking to realize is that actually none of the dikes in the Lower Mainland would protect us from the flood of record. They're not. They weren't built. They were built a long time ago. None of them are seismically reinforced either. So we've got. But the province did an estimate of what it would cost to upgrade all of our coastal defenses back in 2012, and they came up with a staggering amount of money. It was several $1 billion that it would cost, but a large amount of that fell to Surrey and Richmond because of their locations and the amount of diking that they have. But it is quite amazing to realize that even the dikes that we have are not actually to grade. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't protect us now.
Great.
So, but it'll be okay. Well, look, Hannah's got a question. Yay, Hannah. On a personal level, what are ways we can support and ensure initiatives / projects of adaptation? Well, it's such a great question, Hannah, because the difficulty with adaptation is really wrapping one's head around how individuals can support it. Because, the impacts are usually things like flooding and extreme heat. And so it's hard to think of how an individual can support that, or can support, building resilience to that. It really falls to governments a lot of the time because governments are zoning and they're putting in the infrastructure and that kind of thing. But so, you know, it's easier to think about how as individuals we can help to reduce climate change through reducing our emissions, because we can actually individually, each of us can do that. And even though me not driving a car or something like that, or trying to, you know, reduce the heat in my house or do what I can to reduce emissions, maybe buy local food, maybe that won't change the world, but I'll be part of a big movement of people. And that cumulatively, thousands of people all making those decisions will have an effect. So it's easier to think about that than how we individually do adaptation. But I would say there's lots of different ways. We can build our own personal resilience. So actually taking care of ourselves, literally taking care of our own health, mental health, physical health, will make us more resilient to things like extreme heat or disasters. And also just to the kind of psychological impacts of the, you know, the concern over these kinds of things. You can support your local government and write to council and the mayor to say that you'd like to see them take action on these things. It really helps them to see that local voice writing in support. And equally, as I said, supporting equity and supporting those decisions being made in an equitable way. You can also do things like, depending on what access you have to green space, help to collaborate with things like Still Moon, with taking care of the ravine. Like taking care of your local green space will help actually absorb stormwater and reduce what we call the urban heat island effect, which is where there's a lot of concrete obviously amassed in cities, which absorbs, like say in the summer, it's getting hotter and we will see a lot of heat increase. If you have more green space, it cools down the area. And so, you know, volunteering to help with taking care of green spaces. If you have a garden, then putting in more plants for pollinators, that kind of thing. So that could be done in a community way or in your own garden if you have one. Supporting local food, local farmers markets, that kind of thing. So basically just you know, supporting anything to do with nature and the environment in your area is helpful. And supporting your leaders and decision makers to take action is also really helpful. And that goes for the federal government too, federal, provincial, local, right to those people that, you know, so few people actually do. And they know that. So when they get a letter, they know it represents about 1,000 people because so many people never actually do it. But you would be amazed at how powerful it is to send in those messages to our elected leaders. And don't forget, they work for you. They're not some sort of special people on pedestals. They're just folks who are supposed to be doing what we want them to do. So I hope that was a bit helpful. And so Anna, so I'm just reading your question. What did I mean about the Thames having issues other than flooding, something about energy? Oh, what I was saying there was that that there's more flooding. So it is actually the flooding I was referring to. They used the floodgates more often than they thought they would because they had more floodwaters coming up than they thought they would. And so the reason I was saying that they had more floodwaters coming up was because as the atmosphere warms up, I guess it's a bit like boiling a kettle, it starts to get more energized. So that's why, you know, people think we're seeing more hurricanes and tornadoes and that sort of thing, because the atmosphere actually has more energy in it. And so that leads to more storms, which leads to more floods. So that's what I was talking about the energy part.
Okay, I didn't know that at all about the atmosphere having more energy in it or that causing more storms. You know, that I just didn't know that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's I think that it's probably not the case everywhere either. So in places where there tend to be storms, you're getting more of them. Like say in the Gulf, where they've been having sort of more intense tornadoes and what do they call those? Is that hurricanes? Yeah. The things that hit the Florida Keys all the time.
Hurricanes?
Yeah, hurricanes. Yeah, they think those are getting a bit bigger because of you know, things like Hurricane Sandy. They're doing what they call attribution science, where you know, these things happened already. We already had hurricanes, but what you call attribution science is where scientists measure it and they go, well, how many percentage bigger was this because of climate change? And they're starting to say things like, well, it's probably 5% bigger. So it's not creating the thing, but it is magnifying it.
Mm-hmm. So I guess is it the Maldives that are becoming uninhabitable, and Bangladesh is really already in a bad location, right?
Yes, that's right. So the Maldives is a great example, and so the other small island states, you know, they're the ones who are really screaming about this deadline to reduce our emissions, because the idea was to try and keep global warming to under 1.5 degrees. So we've already had a degree, or maybe 0.9 of a degree, and you know, basically the models show that if we go over 1.5 degrees of warming, the small island states will get inundated. And they're already getting, I mean, many of them are so low lying that they're already getting eroded and really bad flooding, which is making it really hard for people to live there. So you've already got people from what are the islands off the Pacific Islands anyway, getting the right to citizenship, for instance, in New Zealand, because their homes are going to be gone. I mean, it's really unthinkable. And so the small island states slogan is 1.5 to stay alive. And I was proud of Catherine McKenna, our former environment minister, because she, you know, she stood with those people back in the first climate conference that she was minister for. However, I think it's highly unlikely that we'll keep it that we'll succeed, unfortunately. And the average looks like we'll hit 3 degrees. Hopefully we can keep it to 2. Maybe there'll be enough global will to do it. But it means they lose their homes, which of course is, you know, as I say, quite unthinkable. And Bangladesh is a really interesting example. So Bangladesh is one of the poorest countries in the world, as you pointed out, and they have projected that I think it's 10 million people will be displaced from the coast by sea level rise within the next 10 years. So they're probably seeing subsidence as well. So I was talking about isostatic rebound earlier, but that's where things are rising. You also get subsidence, which obviously is where things are sinking and it makes it worse. Sometimes in places like Jakarta, that's happening because people are extracting so much groundwater that they're actually making their city sink, which is, you know, drastically bad news for them. But Bangladesh is, I think it's just sinking, and they have sea level rise. So Bangladesh is fiercely independent despite its poverty, and they have a IPCC author called Salim Huq, who is world-renowned adaptation specialist, and he's a great Bangladeshi leader. And what Bangladesh has said is they're going to do a Bangladesh adaptation solution that's made in Bangladesh. They don't want any help, thank you very much. And they're doing a great example of, remember I was saying how adaptation has to be iterative. It has to be planned kind of, you know, you have to adapt it as you go along. So they're doing what I think is one of the best examples of that I've seen to date, because of the drastic importance of it, but also it's kind of just its ingenuity, which is that, so there's many fisher people who live along the coast of Bangladesh, and their livelihoods are being impacted because of saltwater intrusion into not just their fisheries, but also, I guess, their where they raise food. And so many of them have children also. And so what Bangladesh's plan is to do is to work with the current generation of adults to help them adapt their fisheries and their food crops that they're growing along there to salt-tolerant varieties. And they're, meanwhile, preparing 10 cities for the people to move to. And they're going to start educating the children of those adults that they're going to have different livelihoods from their parents, and help them prepare for a dignified relocation to those cities, which will be, you know, in their service, not, you know, a kind of a catastrophic displacement, but an intentional movement that is supported by education and preparation. So I hope they succeed in that plan. It's ambitious, and but you know, I just think it's just got my huge admiration. So it's one of the best global examples I know of adaptation.
Because I would think that that there are some powers that would like that to become like an industrial camp, and I guess the Bangladeshis probably don't want that. Maybe that's why they want to handle it their own way.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think I mean I do think that there's been a bit of I'm not sure about the industrial camp part, but there is quite a bit of sensitivity in the global south about northern experts coming in and saying we're going to fix all your problems and here's some money, and you know, and it's the exact opposite of the equitable approach I was talking about, and I think a lot of it was well-meaning, but we're kind of starting to try and do things better, and so their stance is also about, you know, global south responses for the global south, not, you know, northern experts who come from societies where we emitted all the carbon in the first place. Woohoo, we've caused the problem. Now we'll come and help you guys out with your, you know, your drastic impacts of all this carbon we've been emitting up here in Canada and North America and Europe. And so I think there's a bit of that about it too. It's a global south solution made in the global south. I'm just looking at Ming's question here. Thanks, Ming. Any strategic approach to convince local council or government to see the benefit of the long-term impact of green versus grey infrastructure when their political term is quite short? Actually, so all of the values that I just took, so I'm not sure if you were here when I was talking about the kinds of values that we can talk about that ecosystems provide, but there's a couple of different answers to your question. So first of all, there's this organization called the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative. So all municipalities have assets on their books. So their buildings, the buildings that are owned by everything that's owned by the local government is considered an asset that they are investing in and taking care of. And they have to show that they're doing a good job of that. And they also have to show the value of their assets. And so we're starting, because I said ecosystems are critical infrastructure, we're starting to actually characterize the presence of green space as critical infrastructure. And so it's actually, we are moving towards, for the first time ever, local governments being able to actually list green features as assets on their books, which suddenly changes their status. And you know, it's a sad thing. In my opinion, they should already have, you know, value because of their intrinsic value. But let's just call it what it is. This is how local governments work. And so once the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative is working with lots of local governments all over the place to show the value, particularly in terms of reduction of flood, to the local government right now, let alone the long term. So that discussion is already well underway, and Vancouver's an example of a local government that sees the value and has supported development of the Rain City strategy. Another strategic approach is the one I talked about, where we were working with Metro Vancouver to build the support for regionalizing green infrastructure and supporting these large-scale connected up green corridors and ecosystems. That's the regional growth strategy is a long-term plan. So it's now in there, and that's Metro Vancouver 2040, and it's also, I think, in their Climate 2050 plan. So it's looking at what are the policy mechanisms that guide development, and how do you get it in there? And so, as I say, we've succeeded in doing that with Metro Vancouver, and we were pushing on an open door. They're really enthusiastic about this kind of thing, actually. So there's that. Then there's also examples like case studies. I mean, you know, even like we were talking about engineers earlier, they're always like, well, that sounds great, show me how it works. So, you know, a lot of the time we're putting together case studies that show how things have already been implemented and valued and shown. So there's a great example around here from Gibson's, which Gibson's has a very progressive chief administrative officer called Manny Machado. And Manny already saw the value of ecosystem health and wanted to make sure that it was prioritized in his city. And so they did a whole cost-benefit analysis on the comparative costs and benefits of rehabilitating a wetland and putting in a new drainage system. And it clearly showed that rehabilitating the wetland was not only cheaper to do and maintain, but it would provide more benefits for the community across the board. And I talked a bit about that kind of thinking earlier. And that became the root of this whole municipal natural assets initiative that's now taken off nationally. And so giving examples like that from a local government, admittedly Gibson's is a small and kind of rural because they're like very surrounded by ecosystems, but City of Surrey is also doing this, City of Vancouver is also doing it. And the more that do it, and the more that we make that visible, the more that others take it up. So we, for instance, on our website, which is, if you just Google ACT, the Adaptation to Climate Change team, we've got a whole report called Accounting for Natural Assets, which is just a easy to understand set of examples of like many different projects in different places that already exist and the calculations are already done, showing the adaptation benefits, the carbon reduction benefits, and then the co-benefits of projects across Canada that have used these approaches. So I think the evidence is building to the point, Ming, where it's actually becoming an easier and easier case to make to the local government. The most important thing is to make it to developers because a lot of the time, you know, our local governments are in a tough spot because the way that municipal finance is arranged in Canada, the only money that municipal governments collect is property tax in terms of their income. And so it's not in their interests to take out development. It's in their interests actually to maximize it. And that's not really their fault because it's their only income. And so if we can convince developers to prioritize green space on their developments and show that it'll actually increase their property values, then that's another approach as well. So there's lots of different ways into that discussion. Well, thanks, Emma. Yeah, developers, yeah. But there's even developers will, you know, get the picture if we make the case to them. And I've had some really interesting discussions with developers. So we had the policy vice president for the Urban Development Institute coming to a lot of meetings that we were doing about low carbon resilience. And, you know, he was talking about the risk that developers take because developers spend a very large amount of money to secure plots of land. And then they have to build the development and then they have to sell it before they get any of that money back. And so if something happens like what happened in Calgary in 2013, where a massive flood happened and Calgary started to redraw where its floodplain was because they hadn't done that before. And this is why we all need to do our climate risk assessments so we can get our future picture in there before we sink money into things, before we know what's coming. You know, developers who bought land in Calgary that suddenly ended up in the floodplain when it wasn't before, after the Calgary flood, you know, maybe they bought it 5 years before in you know, 2008, 2013, there's a massive flood. They're only 5 years into the development. They've still got another 5 years to go. And suddenly their, you know, multi-million-dollar investment is in jeopardy. Well, nobody wants to see them lose their money, right? So it's, you know, this is all part of our industry sector. So what we have to do is help them make good decisions so that they are secure. And maybe part of that is zoning in that you have to include flood mitigation. That includes green space. And, you know, anyways, it's a long and interesting discussion, but developers are like, well, wait a second, we're not all bad guys. We're trying to do the best here. And we need help too. So anyway, they're not, there's like lawyers and accountants, they're hard to defend, but anyway, well, I think that's it for the questions. Looks like that was really great. Thanks thanks everyone that asked questions, and I hope this was helpful. I know I covered a lot of ground, but it's a big topic, and there's lots to discuss. So.
Well, it's so fascinating, Deb, because you've just got such a global perspective and all the different complexities of why it's hard to move forward, but all the ways that we can move forward is kind of great. And yeah, it's nice to be able to link what we're doing on this small scale in Still Creek to the bigger initiatives. So yeah, thank you so much, Deb. It's just amazing.
You're really welcome, and that's why I'm looking forward to sharing this chapter with you in the book, because it is the global picture, and it brings it again and again down to what you did in Still Creek, and how if we could all get that going everywhere in the world, lots of the problems would be solved. So keep up the good work. It's an amazing organization.
Well, lots more work to do.
Yeah, it'll never be over. That's a good thing, though.
For sure. Well, thank you so much, Deb. Yeah, there are a lot of things that were cleared up for me, and just super important perspectives to move forward for all of us, and how we can navigate ourselves in this complex situation that we're in. But there is that shining light, and we are making that happen, and it's becoming brighter as we continue forward. So thank you so much for reaffirming that. And I just want to thank everyone that was here right now to witness this in real time. There were some questions about whether or not this will be uploaded, and yes, it will be. This will be on Still Moon Art Society's YouTube channel. If you follow Still Moon Art Society on social media, that's on Facebook and Instagram, that link will be there when it is uploaded, and for your viewing pleasure. And please feel free to share widely, talk about this with your friends, your family. We need all this information to keep doing its course. We can all get informed. The email address.
I'll just put that here.
Yes.
While I'm doing this, I just remembered that for Hannah's question, the other thing you can do that's quite tangible is ensure your house's drainage is good. I forgot to say that. They're actually training home inspectors now to take into account climate change. So drainage systems.
There you have it. You heard it first. Get your drainage in your house looked after.
Right, it's not easy. But yeah, that's one way to cope with increasing precipitation, rain.
Yeah.
Any other name. Okay, well, thanks so much, guys, and look forward to seeing you in Still Creek.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, y'all. Have a beautiful night, everybody.
Thank you too. Bye.
Hello. Bye.